Welcome to another By Study and Faith Virtual Fireside, sponsored by the Howard W. Hunter Foundation and the Mormon Studies Council, which is affiliated with the Mormon Studies program at Claremont Graduate University here in Southern California, where we are. My name is Matt Bowman. I am the Howard W. Hunter Chair of Mormon Studies at Claremont Graduate University, and I direct the Mormon Studies program there. This is my wife, Tamara. We're pleased to host you tonight. We do these firesides because they're a chance for everyone to develop a more personal connection with some distinguished Latter-day Saint disciple scholars in the church. We want to bridge the gaps between faith and academia and help us all think through issues affecting the lives of all of us who are trying to live a life of faith, hope, and charity in our world today.
Before introducing our speakers for this evening, we're going to start with a couple of housekeeping items. You will note that the chat box is disabled. If you have a question, and we hope you do, please put them in the Q&A box that can be found at the bottom of your screen. And if you have not already done so, go ahead and sign up for our email list so that you can know about future events, other firesides, and Mormon study events. You will find a link in your screen in the chat box on our CGU Mormon Studies website or on our Facebook page. And please share this link with your friends and family. Also, if you enjoy this fireside and want to support the cause of global Mormon studies, we invite you to make a donation. However large or small, it's easy to do. Just click on the link found on the email announcement of this fireside or on our CGU website. These programs are supported 100% by donations, and so we are grateful in advance for your help.
We're going to start this evening with a benediction that will be offered by Rick Richmond. Rick is a distinguished trial attorney. He is a past chairman of the Mormon Studies Council and is currently the vice chair of the Howard W. Hunter Foundation. And if I may say, he is a great supporter of our work here. We appreciate his efforts.
Thank you, Matt. I'll offer the invocation and not the benediction, if that's okay with you. Our Father in heaven, we're grateful this evening for all of our many blessings. We're thankful to have the Sabbath day in which we are able to put aside the normal cares of the world so that we might remember and worship Thee and Thy Son, Jesus Christ. We pray this evening as we reflect on the history of the restoration of Thy church and of our own history, that it might be instructive to us, that we might be inspired, and that it might cause us to think about the present and the future in ways that we might not have thought about those previously. We pray that that would be with our speakers, that they might be inspired as they speak with us this evening. We pray for all those who need Thy blessings in this world at this time, which are many, and we pray for this, and we do it in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. Thank you for that invocation, Rick. I will now introduce our speakers. Lisa Olsen Tait, I should say, and Jed Woodworth. We normally have one speaker, but tonight we have invited two, in large part because of the wonderful project that they are engaged in is, I think, a model for how we might think about Zion. It's collaborative, it's a joint effort. And it models for us, I think, the beautiful possibilities of what joint creation by a community might offer us. The new official history of the church, the 4-volume work Saints, the Church of Jesus Christ in the Latter Days, is a product of the work of not only many talented historians, but many gifted writers as well. And the end result is greater than the skills of any single contributor. We're lucky to have here with us tonight two of that team. Lisa Olsen Tait has been a historian writer and a specialist in women's history at the Church History Department since 2013. Before that, she taught religion at BYU Provo. She earned her PhD at the University of Houston, studying American literature and women's studies. Her dissertation was a study of Latter-day Saint women in the 1890s as seen through the Young Woman's Journal. She and her husband, Mike, live in Highland with their special needs daughter and 2 dogs, which is exactly the right number. They also have 3 sons. When she's not working, she enjoys exercise, hiking, biking, gardening, and crochet. Jed Woodworth is a historian, also employed by the Church History Department. He is currently the managing historian of Saints. Prior to coming to the Church History Department in 2011, he worked at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he earned his PhD. He has other degrees from BYU and Harvard. He's the husband of Shauna Clough, and together they have 6 children. So, as I have noted, our guests will have time for a fair amount of Q&A at the end. Please put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And I'll turn it over to you guys. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you, Matt and Tamara, and I appreciate all of those on the planning committee. It's really a great privilege to be here tonight. You know, there's this old Mormon joke about how the second coming is going to be on Super Bowl Sunday, but I feel like it's whenever Saints is going to be discussed and there's a fireside, there's going to be a test on which one you choose. But I hear that the game is not much of a game, so I do appreciate you coming, and I hope that this is not just an enlightening experience for you, but edifying and faith promoting. I'm going to take about 15 minutes before passing the baton to Lisa. And I have some slides that I would like to show, so I will share my screen now. So if you're tuning into this fireside, I think most of you know what Saints is, but I have to do a little bit of background. So some of this may be repetition for some of you, but hopefully it will be interesting as well. Saints is a multi-volume history, the latest in a line, and I'm going to talk about some of those other iterations. It's a 4-volume history. So I think we need everyone to be on mute. Could we get all the microphones on mute, please? Thanks so much. 2 volumes of this history have been published so far. The first volume, Standard of Truth, came out in 2018. No Unhallowed Hand, Volume 2, came out a month before the pandemic came upon us. Now, I mentioned that it's in dialogue, this multi-volume history, with other attempts. The first attempt, of course, was Joseph Smith himself writing a documentary history of the church. And, you know, hold on one second. You won't believe this, but that is the wrong set of slides. Okay. It always has to be something, doesn't it? Okay, so where I wanted to go after showing you the cover art of the 4 volumes is to show you where the titles came from. Joseph Smith wrote a letter. It's in dispute that he's the author, but in 1842, he sent a letter to the editor of a Chicago newspaper where he gave the famous quotation on the Standard of Truth. And the titles of the 4 volumes are taken from this letter. And what's interesting is we actually have the titles that go in order. So volume 1, you see at the beginning, the Standard of Truth. No Unhallowed Hand is volume 2's title. Boldly, Nobly, and Independent is the volume 3 title. And volume 4 is Sounded in Every Ear. And these titles, we feel like, encapsulate a chronological narrative of the church's history of establishing a standard of truth, proclaiming it, and then ultimately having it sound in every ear. Now, this is the slide I wanted to show you. Joseph Smith's attempt was a documentary history. And today, when you read the history of the church in 7 volumes, many of us have this on our shelves. It's not scintillating reading. And certainly, I mean, one of the biggest knocks against it for all of its merits is that it ends in 1846. So clearly, this history is not one that is sufficient for our own age. B.H. Roberts' comprehensive history, published in 1930, was an attempt to summarize 100 years of church history. Now, when you read B.H. Roberts today, the sentences are very long, 20, 30 words or more. It's sort of high Victorian prose. And it's great reading in some ways, but it obviously is dated. And I'm going to say more about this, the reasons why B.H. Roberts' history is dated. But this was a great history in its time. Roberts was one of the foremost intellects of the church and a fine writer in his own right. Now, there are a series of books that came out in the 80s and 1990s that actually were commissioned by the church's authorities as part of a projected 16-volume church sesquicentennial history. It was abandoned for a number of reasons, one of which was that the church was not ready at that time to take ownership over the various interpretations of the authors. And so the authors were freed then to publish on their own. And we never got all 16 volumes. There's a little more than half that ended up being published, and you see some of the titles here. Many people don't realize that these books that they know well were actually part of an official history that was projected. Now, I mentioned I was going to come back to B.H. Roberts. And when B.H. Roberts was writing in 1930, this is a pie graph of the church's history, the church's demographic. The population was 90% in the United States. We had just barely gone into Central America, or South America rather, in Argentina. We'd only been there 4 years. And so the membership of the church was largely US and European. And so Robert's history reflected that demographic. There were virtually no stories of people of color, largely because there were very few people of color at that time, but also it just wasn't on his radar. And Lisa knows this well, that he also wrote or quoted few women's voices. Roberts was not an advocate of women's suffrage. And so that also is reflected in the history. Now in 2010, when the Saints project was approved by the Monson presidency, look at how the demographic has changed. You have a huge slice that is light green that represents South America. Asia is 7%. We're now in Africa, Mexico, Central America is 15%. And so there's a lot more variegation. And we needed a history that reflected what the church looked like in 2010. Not just because 80 years had passed since Roberts wrote, but because the nature of the church and the composition of its members had changed. And so Saints is designed not only to take the history into the present, but to account for the changing nature of the membership. Now, this is reflected in the publication of Saints in 14 languages, and I'm very proud of this as the managing historian. When Saints is published, at least volume 1 and volume 2, it was published live online in all 14 languages, meaning English did not precede the other languages. And so these, you can see which languages are represented. In the church, we have what is called the Internet 10, which is the 10 basic languages that 95% of church membership speak as a first language. And these are the usual suspects: English, Spanish, French, Portuguese, German, Italian, Japanese, Korean, Chinese, Russian. I think I have them all. But then we decided that we would publish also in 2 Filipino languages, Tagalog and Cebuano, and Tongan and Samoan. And so this, as I say, this is the church today. This is the modern church where the message, the standard of truth, goes out everywhere at the same time. Now, I'd like to talk for just a few minutes about what makes saints different. And I'm not going to cover all of these. I would like to cover about 1.5 to 2 of them. So let's talk about the method. When you pick up a work of history, I think most of us understand what we're getting into, or we wouldn't read history. There are, of course, different ways of writing history, some more or less engaging to the public. But Saints is not just a work of history. It is also, it aspires to be a work of literature. Now, this may sound strange because, you know, one of the criticisms of Saints is, well, the writing is simplistic. And my answer to that is, well, so are the parables of Jesus. Parables of Jesus are very simple, and maybe we should distinguish simplistic from simple. But if you study the narrative structure of Saints, it's actually not simplistic. The writing, the vocabulary may be, but there is much complexity written into the scenes and the interweaving of the scenes. And you have to look for it. I mean, of course, I would recommend anyone reread Saints to find the complexity, but there is great depth in the writing, despite the fact that it is accessible vocabulary. And then, of course, we are concerned about audience. How do you reach an audience that is worldwide, where you can appeal to people in Los Angeles who study at Claremont and people who live, let's say, in the Philippines or Uganda or, you know, Mexico City or wherever it is, you know, Alberta, Canada. It's a tall task. And so any kind of style that you pick, you are going to alienate some constituency that you're trying to reach. And so what we settled on with Saints was some style that we felt like would reach everyone, but would have appeal to different constituencies. And I'll mention that a little bit further on. So we were looking for a sweet spot between history, literature, and appealing to a large church audience. Now, in standard historical writing, the tone is often very flat. And those of you who study at Claremont, I think you understand this. I mean, of course, there's advocacy in some forms of historical writing, but I think most history aims to sort of have a value-free tone. I think we get this from the sciences, the natural sciences. It goes way back. But it's a very even tone, but the flatness of the tone can create disinterest. I mean, people put the book down if you are not interested in history. I think one of the reasons why David McCullough is so widely read is that he's trained in English for one, but I think also he understands that history needs to engage at an emotional level. And so what Saints does is it tries to get around this problem of the flat line, which creates, this is how young people would feel if we tried to write in a very flat, linear way. Our readers would not stay with us. Now, one of the things that we do to make Saints appealing is a very simple thing. If you open up Saints on the first page of every chapter, you'll find a little woodcut. Now, those of you, some of you can look at the image on the right and know immediately what this is. This is a page from Harry Potter, right? And on the left is a Spanish language page from Saints. And so we did adopt this. Now, don't run out and say Saints is imitating Harry Potter. Of course, the author of Harry Potter did not invent the woodcut either. But the point is, you have a woodcut that is engaging. It's not photos. We know that research has shown that if a book has photos, people will look at the photos and not read the text. This has actually been demonstrated. And so it's one of the reasons why we didn't put photos in Saints. We didn't want people just look at the photos and read the captions. But the woodcut is an invitation to find out what is in this chapter. And so every woodcut is chosen to invite a question in the minds of the readers. What is going to be, why this woodcut? And so the structure of every Saints chapter is the structure of a novel imposed on history. So there is a grabber at the beginning in scene 1. There's rising and falling action. Sometimes I get this question, why does there have to be so much fighting? Well, part of it is the 19th century, the Saints have a violent relationship with their neighbors, but the other answer is that we do pick dramatic stories. Out of all the stories we might pick, we are looking for stories that will grip the reader and hold attention. There's a climax in every chapter, and then there's a kicker that would prompt the reader to keep going. Now, I want to say just a few words. My time is running out. There will be plenty of time for questions, but I mentioned that we're trying to appeal to this broad readership, right? And the narrative, you can think of that as just the baseline that appeals to the masses. Someone who, I remember a guy telling me, this is back to David McCullough, he said, I'm not a reader at all, but I've read the John Adams biography 6 times. And I was just so interested in that. I mean, how is it that David McCullough is able to capture people, or even Gerald Lund? I mean, Gerald Lund, there's obviously a split opinion on his writing. Some people love it, some people don't, but he succeeded on a great level of getting people interested, getting art people interested in church history. And so the narrative is designed to appeal to that level. But then there are references, so there's scholarly apparatus. And I think this gets to Matt's opening about how faith and scholarship are wedded in Saints. This is not a work of fiction. Every detail, even down to the weather, is documented. So it is of course, it's an interpretation, it's a creation of minds, but it's not a fictional creation. It's perfectly legitimate. The dialogue is not made up. Of course, we have the problem of memory, but that's a problem that any historian has. So you can follow the references, and if you read online, on the online version of Saints, every reference that is in like a primary source that's in the church's possession is hyperlinked. So you can actually read the original. And I would recommend, if you're interested in Saints, yeah, the paper edition is great, but if you read online, you can read all the original documents that are in the church's possession just by following a link in the footnotes. Then there are topics and videos. Large number of topics and videos. I'll show you a slide on that in just a second. And the topics are sort of a deep dive. Notice that we're going down in depth. And now we're starting to appeal more to graduate student types, academics. The topics are issues that we know are fascinating to people and of interest, but we don't have time to pause and linger and do what historians love to do, which is just parse evidence. Because if we do that, we lose most of our readers. So we've decided, look, there's a place for that, to have a discursive discussion, but it's not in the running text. It's going to be in a specialized topic. And then finally, at the back of the topics underneath, there's more scholarship that is recommended. And so in this way, Saints is designed to appeal to the broadest possible audience while preserving a core narrative text that is engaging to people. Here's an example of the topics. And Lisa is going to say about more about where you find these. Seer Stones, for example. We know people are interested in Seer Stones. So the running text mentions them and in a non-controversial way, but then the topic itself can go into more detail about specific issues with evidence, for example. Here's a list. This is now a dated list, but all of these topics were in volume 1. We have more topics that were written for volume 2. And in your, some people ask, well, where do you find these topics? I mean, how do you know about them? In the footnotes, there's a bold heading that says church history topic, : and then the name. And when you see that bolded heading in the footnote at the back of the book, you know that you should go online and read the topic. So we don't have room in the footnotes themselves, of course, to have the topic, but this is online content. Really, it's a beautiful thing that the digital age allows us to do. There are a number of videos that have been made that people love. If you're a visual learner, we have videos on various topics. And finally, one of the more interesting things that I've found as the managing historian is how people consume Saints. We have a number of platforms where you can find it, but we found, especially with millennials, most of them listen to it. They like the audio, and you know, I'm not that way myself, but so the audio, again, this is a digital, the age in which we live allows these multi-platform, multi-sensory experience. You can listen in the morning and hold the book in the afternoon. And it's really great. And people love, you know, the audio voice, well-beloved voice. I won't reveal who it is. Many people already have figured it out. But anyway, I really appreciate being able to give just a little bit of the outline of what Saints is. And I'll get into more detail after Lisa shows you her slides and gives a presentation. Thanks.
Okay, Jed, if you can stop sharing your screen, I'll do mine. I don't have as many slides as Jed. And in fact, before we go to the slides, I just thought I would take a second here and show you, if we were in an in-person fireside, this would be the moment when I invite everyone to pull out your phone and open it up to your Gospel Library app. And then within the Gospel Library app, you will find the Restoration and Church History section. And within that section, Saints, the full text of the books will be one of the first things you see there. And within that section for each book, you can also access the audio, just like you do for general conference talks and any other content on the Gospel Library. And if you go down a little bit farther, you'll find the church history topics section. This is what Jed's just been talking about. You can access these topics on their own. You don't have to click through links elsewhere. They're all contained here in this section. They make for, you know, interesting reading just here and there, if you have a minute. And then next to them are the church history videos. These also, many of them are directly linked to the Saints books and tell stories or feature some of us having conversations and talking about some of the issues in church history. I want to make you aware of this, this church history section on the app, because there's a lot of really rich content here that people might not be aware of. So in addition to this material on saints, we also have a section with the gospel topics essays themselves. We also have a women's history section. That's a relatively recent addition here. And in that section, you'll find the At the Pulpit book with the women collection of women's discourses. And you'll also find the full text of the first 50 years, which is a documentary history of the Relief Society up to 1892. And then if you haven't been aware of it, we also have this section called Global Histories. And this is one of the just fabulous projects that our department is working on right now. And I don't know how many dozens we're up to now that have been published, but we have many dozens more in the works. And these are short histories of the church in various countries and areas around the world. And as part of those, of each of those histories, you'll find stories that are often written in kind of the same saints style, where we meet a person and learn about their experience, as well as an overview of the church in that country and you know, statistical information about the growth of the church, and then the stories that go with it. Some of them have videos as well, and they're linked into the church history video section. So these make wonderful resources for talks, for lessons, for family home evening, just for your own viewing. And we want to make sure that you're aware of all the great material that we have made available. There is also a section on Doctrine and Covenants study resources in that Restoration and Church History section on the Gospel Library app. So we want to make sure that that people are aware of this great material that we have. I think I'll just share one slide here. Let's see if I can do this in the right order. Right here. Okay. I'm going to compliment what Jed has done here on the kind of nuts and bolts of the project, and talk at a little higher level of theory about why the style and the approach for saints is, we think, is effective. And that is the power of narrative, the power of stories, and why we felt it was so important to structure the books around this style. There's a biblical scholar named Peter Enns who has noted that this Bible is the story of God told from the limited point of view of real people living in a certain place and time. And moreover, he points out, God lets his children tell the story. So the same could be said of church history in general. It's the story of the Lord's hand in the lives of his children, told by those children from their human point of view. The Lord has commanded us to tell the story. Section 21 of the Doctrine and Covenants, the revelation given at the meeting where the church is organized, begins, "Behold, a record shall be kept among you." And in that revelation, in that verse, it goes on to say it'll be a record of, speaking to Joseph Smith as a prophet, seer, and revelator. And what that means is that the record we keep is a sacred history that is to show the hand of the Lord in the unfolding of the church. So the Lord has commanded that that record be kept, but he hasn't told us how to do it. And he hasn't given us detailed instructions other than to say that this sacred history is to bear witness of his hand. When Joseph Smith was in Liberty Jail, the Lord said to him, "Know thou, my son, that all these things shall give thee experience," period. And it's always been interesting to me that the revelation doesn't elaborate on that. It doesn't say what kind of experience. It doesn't explicitly tell him what he's supposed to learn or how to interpret it. Experience itself is presented as a primary purpose of life and is a good in and of itself. Well, saints is about experience. By reading stories told from the perspective of participants, we share in their experiences. Now we know also that stories serve an important function in developing identity. We learn who we are largely through stories. There's been quite a lot of research on this in recent years. One writer put it this way: the single most important thing you can do for your family may be to develop a strong family narrative. One study showed that the more children knew about their family's history, the stronger their sense of control over their lives, the higher their self-esteem, and the more successfully they believed their families functioned. So family narratives give children a sense of intergenerational awareness. They know that they belong to something bigger than themselves, or as my grandma used to say, they belong somewhere in the world. The most healthy family narrative, as this slide shows, is called the oscillating family narrative. This is the story of how we have been through ups and downs, successes and failures, sorrow and joy, but we have stuck together through it all because we are family. This idea can be applied to the church. We see ourselves as a family. In fact, we call each other brother and sister, for starters, and we regard ourselves as the children of God. So as Saints shows, we, meaning Latter-day Saints, have developed a collective identity and consciousness. And as a family, we have an oscillating narrative. We haven't been perfect. We've had failings and challenges. We've had triumphs and successes. But through it all, we are a family because of our shared identity and commitment to the restored gospel of Jesus Christ. And our Father's hand has been manifested in that narrative in ways both large and small. And this is the story that Saints tells. I've been asked, why did I get into doing history? What is it about history that I enjoy? And for me, I can answer that question in one word, and it's people. I'm interested in people, in the human condition, the human experience, and how that has been the same over time, how it's changed over time, the common humanity that we share, the different frames and contexts that we've brought to bear on understanding those times and places. So when we read Saints, when we read the stories of the participants, we identify with them, and we see that what we call history, they called life. It's unfolding for them moment by moment, just as the way it is for us. We struggle through each day with limited perspective and partial understanding, and so did they. And this is a powerful perspective to develop, especially in regard to figures who may easily be kind of mythologized as larger than life. We didn't seek to cut anybody down to size in Saints, so to speak, but we did want to reflect their common humanity and the essential humanity of people. And so this means that in Saints, we will meet ordinary people, and we'll meet well-known and famous people, but always on terms of them as an individual and trying to get to know them and understand what they experienced. Whether it's Brigham Young wading through the mud and being happy as a king to help the Saints push their wagons, or taking his little daughter into his arms and telling her to breathe. We have Eliza R. Snow, we have George Q. Cannon, and then we have people like Augusta Dorius and Anna Widtsoe, who are less known figures whose experience also speaks to us of the larger story of our family as Latter-day Saints. I think there's something sacred about seeing the world through another person's eyes. So Saints is about experience, the complex, messy, difficult, beautiful experience of the human condition that is made sacred as we see the hand of the Lord in the midst of life. This is what makes it faith-promoting history. Not because we've created a narrator that tells you what to think about everything, but because we let people's experience speak for itself. And we believe that when it does, that experience bears witness of the hand of the Lord. I think I'm going to stop there so that we have plenty of time for questions. And I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thanks so much. I'm going to go ahead and start off with a quick one, hopefully a quick one for the two of you. We have quite a lot of interest about when volumes 3 and 4 might be coming out and when people can expect that.
Well, I have to be careful on this one because for a couple of reasons. One is we're working very hard, and several of us work way more than the church wants us to work to try and get this volume out this year. And some of you may say, oh, well, this year you got 11 months. Well, it's not that easy. You know, you've got to translate these things into 14 languages. The press needs a few months. So I'll just say that we're still hoping to publish late in the year. You could buy the book as a Christmas present if that works out. But if not, it's going to be early next year. But the good news is the content is really coming together. We're mostly done. It's beautiful. Lisa can speak to that, but I'm very proud of the way the volume is shaping up. 38 chapters, and we're near the end.
I mean, I may be biased because I do most of my work in the period that volume 3 covers, which is 1893 to 1955. But it's so good. I mean, I'm so excited for people to get this book and read it. This is a period of church history that people don't know very much about. And so there will be a lot in here that's new and really interesting. And plus there's all the World War II material that's just fantastic. So yeah, we're pulling out all the stops. Yeah. Jed's burning the midnight oil. We're doing the best we can, but if it's not on the shelves for Christmas, you should be able to pre-order it.
Yeah, there you go. Now, as for volume 4, you know, at one time we told people that we would publish a volume a year, one volume every year. And I regret that now because it raised expectations. It turned out that that was impossible, not because we couldn't write that quickly, but the number of review cycles, which I can mention later, it's really hard. Well, impossible. It turned out to be impossible chronologically to publish in a year because of the review cycles. And every time you ask people to review, you have to give them a couple of weeks if you're giving them a bunch of chapters. So anyway, it's more like a year and a half. So that means if Saints V3 comes out in November of this year, you wouldn't see volume 4 until 2023. If it comes out in the spring of 2022, you're not going to see it until 2024. But we are working. I will add, we've got a large bit of volume 4 already drafted, and that's looking good as well. So I'll leave it at that.
Great. And to be clear, for everybody, if you would like to ask a question, please put it in the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen. We've got a lot coming in already, so we'll try to get to as many as we can. I wonder if you could say a bit, and this is a question that wraps up some people's questions, about the production process of Saints. That is, how is it written? You spoke about the review cycles. Where does it go into review? Who is doing the writing here? How does that go generally?
Well, I'll start off on that one. And I mean, we probably should try to answer this pretty quickly because we could actually talk about this for a long time. And I know we've got other kinds of questions that we want to get to tonight, but the process is actually kind of breathtaking in scope and depth. There's been a team of researchers who do a lot of the frontline researching and identifying sources. The book is drafted, so I'm a volume editor and a historical reviewer on it. So, and Jed's the managing historian, and so we work with the writers to help outline and plan the books, to think about what are the stories we need to tell, what are the issues we need to address, you know, proactively shaping the book and then reviewing and just having those discussions as the process unfolds. And it's a very recursive and collaborative process all the way along. One of the watershed moments in the project was kind of a realization that we came to, that historians are not good creative writers, and that we needed to bring some people with literary training into the process. And so our frontline writers who do the drafting are people with background in fiction, in playwriting, poetry, all kinds of creative writing. And so we work together with them on the history and the writing part. Jed, why don't you take it from there and talk about, once we get the chapters drafted and reviewed among the team, then what happens?
So that Lisa gave you a great summary. I'd like to add a few more details. So when Lisa talks about a team of researchers, it actually is rather small. There's only 5 full-time people who work on Saints. So it's like, you know, the Wizard of Oz, where you pull back Oz and you find, oh, it's just a guy. You know, there's 5 of us. But I want to elaborate on what Lisa said about historians and creative writing. With volume 1, we produced a draft. This was before Lisa and I came on, but because we were working on some other projects. And the attempt was to write narrative, to write in the storytelling style that Lisa has articulated so well. But you can't just read a couple of books and do this. And so we made a course correction after this proto draft, which we called it. We didn't love it, and I'll just say that up front. But we hired a man named James Goldberg, who's probably the brightest guy that most people don't know about. And James is a very creative person, and he's hard to, you know, his background is in English, but he's a poet and a writer and an artist of various kinds. And James came on, and what we did is we decided we're going to marry the historians and creative writers together. And this is one of the things that makes Saints very interesting. Sometimes I get this comment, you know, when I read Saints, it doesn't feel like the same story that I've heard. It's familiar, but the writing is different. And I say, that's because it was written by people who don't know history. It was written by creative writers. And so what we decided was, let's conceptualize what we're trying to do, which is my job and Lisa's job, to create the architecture of the volume. What are the themes? What are the characters? So finding characters is something that I do regularly, but we work in a small team of general editors to vet these characters. But then I might create a scene treatment and even an outline, but then I hand it over to a creative writer and I say, okay, here's the documents, here's what we want to do. You write the first draft. Instead of the historian writing the first draft and then letting the creative writer kind of doll it up, which I think that's usually the standard practice if you have this marriage of different backgrounds. But we let the creative writers write the first draft. And so that's why Saints, I think that's one reason why it's so interesting and appealing, is it just has the narrative structure of someone who's trained in that. And so James ended up hiring a man named Scott Hales, who has a PhD in English from University of Cincinnati. I just say that by way of information, but Scott is a genius too. And he is we used to call him the literary editor, but he's the lead writer of these volumes, and his voice is heard. What we've decided is, instead of everyone getting in and fiddling with the text, we'll let Scott make the edits to the text. So we'll make lots of comments in the margins about what we need to do, but Scott is the one who puts it in his language, and that is a way of keeping continuity of voice across volumes. And so that's part of the process. Now, you asked about review cycles. So once we produce a draft, and the general editors have commented, and those comments get incorporated. And the general editors on the volume that we're working on right now is Lisa, myself, Scott Hales, and Angela Hallstrom, as well as Matt Groh. Now, then we'll send the draft to what we call subject matter experts. So we pick 4 or 5 people who have published in the area of the chapters that we're writing. So we usually send about 4 chapters, Lisa, right? 4 to 5 chapters out to the subject matter experts. So let's say if it's World War II, we'll pick experts who know that period. Some of them are archivists at the church and who maybe haven't published, but they know German or they know Russian or whatever it is. And so they know that period really well. If there are women's stories, we'll send the chapters. One of these subject matter experts will be a woman's historian outside of the general editors. And then we'll get feedback from them after a couple of weeks. We incorporate that feedback. Then we will send the chapters to our editors. Nate Wade is the lead editor of volume 3, and it's all source checked and edited. We give them a few weeks to do this, and then we answer those questions that they raise. After it's cleaned up there, then it goes to a huge group of about 30 external reviewers. And these are not subject matter specific, but these are people who are just generalists, but are smart readers. But I mean, they're all smart readers, but they're different types of people. So some are millennials who are in college. Some are in their 60s and 70s who have held a high church office. Or some are academics, and we get this wide range of feedback from them, and then we incorporate that. Are you bored yet? Then after we incorporate that feedback, the chapters go to our executives, and the executives, this would be Elder Curtis, who's the church historian, the assistant church historian, or Assistant Executive Director, Elder Kyle McKay, Matt Groh, Matt McBride, who's Director of Publications. They read it and offer feedback. Then it goes to correlation. They offer some feedback. We incorporate that. I could talk about correlation at a later time. They're actually great friends, and we've developed a good working relationship. We come at things at a different angle at times, but it's great working with them. And then after correlation is satisfied, then our Apostolic Advisors, we have 2 of them, 2 of the apostles, read everything that the church history department produces in manuscript. We send it to them. They offer feedback. After we've incorporated their feedback, then it goes to the First Presidency, and they're very diligent readers, great readers. I could say more about that later, but then they give us feedback. We incorporate that. Once the First Presidency is satisfied, we're satisfied, and then we go to press at that point.
Well, you said at the beginning, there aren't actually that many people working on Saints, but this sounds like far more than the normal number of historians who write books generally, which is 1.
Yeah, it's a gauntlet. And that allows us to have the 5 full-time people, because we are getting all of this feedback that is coming in. But the people who are actually deciding what to do with it is relatively small.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it's impressive that you have this many people working together to produce a single product, right? And there's something kind of beautiful about that. We do have a couple of people who are interested in what kind of feedback you've received from general authorities. And if you might have anything you might want to share about conversations you've had with them about readability, if they're concerned primarily about doctrine, anything like that you're able to share.
Yeah, Well, it's a good question. How would I answer that? I will say that the general authority readers have been immensely useful to us in the drafting stage. So I've told this story before about how Volume 2, when it went to the First Presidency, we were very happy with what we had. And they came back with some extended comments. And it really reshaped what we did in a couple of significant ways. I'm not going to get into the details, but I'll just say that I personally and another member of our team, I remember talking about this with him, and I just said, I am inspired by the fact that the presidency could see things that we just didn't see and that we didn't notice, and they were right on. And so that was faith promoting for me to realize that our leaders at the head are able to discern things that the smarty pants historians can't see, and very humbling to me as well. As for their reaction, I'm getting positive feedback from them. I mean, I think that once it's gone through the gauntlet of all these readers, it's pretty well accepted. That is to say, we've handled the criticism by this point when it's published. Now, some of these stories are new, and some of them are, let's say, they're troubling. Volume 3 has 2.5 chapters on the Mountain Meadows Massacre. Church publications have never dealt with the massacre in this level of detail. We've had Ensign articles here or there, but for decades after the massacre, we didn't say boo about what went on there or our responsibility for what went on there. And so it's very gratifying to me that what we've been able to do with saints is to normalize things that have been troubling or difficult or shameful, that we've been able to incorporate them. By normalize, I don't mean making them like they don't matter or they're just normal events. They're not normal, but I mean that they're incorporated into the flow of our history, our collective past. And just like the Doctrine and Covenants says, if the saints have sinned, it shall be known. And that's part of what we learn. I think that's the history of Israel in the Old Testament, that the Lord has to chastise his people. That's part of the way we learn. So that's sort of a roundabout answer, Matt. Maybe Lisa has more insight to that question.
Well, I think we want to keep moving, so I won't say much else.
What are you saying, Lisa? I'm taking too long on my answers.
Saying we've only got half an hour left, so we need to get some more questions. Yeah.
Well, here's one for you. So as far as, you're excavating new characters, you're excavating new stories, you're putting new emphasis on some stories that we might have known but didn't really touch on. So what are the repercussions for manuals, for future editions of Come Follow Me, for conversations that future missionaries might have with investigators? Lisa, if you want to take that.
Why don't you start, Lisa?
I think we can already see it happening. For example, in Come Follow Me this year, there are links within the material, both the lesson material for teachers and the reading material for members, that will take you to sections of saints. And so I think the repercussions, as Jed has been saying, is that we'll have a new baseline narrative that will become the collective understanding of our history. And it's a much more nuanced, a much more complete, a much more sophisticated narrative than what we've had in the past. And, we could, again, talk for a long time about the history of doing history and why history has been done the way it was in the past, and what the desires and motivations and ideas about history were that drove that. But suffice it to say that that we are developing this stronger, more nuanced narrative that will now become the baseline. And yes, it's absolutely being worked into curriculum with seminaries, with institutes, with Come Follow Me.
Yeah.
So I think it's going to unfold over, this coming generation. I think by the time the millennials' children and grandchildren are studying church history, this will be thoroughly baked in.
Right. So
to
there's
what
a
they learn.
term that you see, it's not unique to LDS history, but it does surface in our history, called Interlocking Directorate. And an interlocking directorate is basically that in people who are absorbed in business enterprises that are somehow related often sit on the same boards, and those relationships, like the board of executives, and those relationships come into play in how the various businesses are operated. And I think of that in terms of, Saints is not at the vanguard of our department's production. Of course, that would be the JSP. And if you look at Saints Volume 1, you look at the footnotes, the JSP is everywhere. I mean, the scholarship there, they uncovered the documents and they have interpreted the documents in helpful ways in Volume 1. As we moved into Volume 2, you see the Relief Society documents. Forgive me, Lisa, what's the title of the book?
First 50 years.
Yeah, First 50 Years. So the history of Relief Society is cited repeatedly in Volume 2. In Volume 3, At the Pulpit, a collection of women's sermons over the history of time is cited, and so on. Now, we don't have a lot of publications, but they're starting to accumulate, and they're very important publications. Now, I think Come Follow Me is interesting because Saints is going into them, so it's not, Come Follow Me is a priesthood department publication. And if you look at not the introductory chapter, but chapter 1 and chapter 2, the weeks that we've already covered in January, they have a couple of See Also Saints, and then the page numbers. And I was talking to the managing historian, he's the product manager of Come Follow Me, a few days ago, and he just dropped this figure, which I'm happy to say because it reflects well on Saints. He said, Jed, did you notice that Saints has 20 million page views in January? And I said, no, I didn't notice that. He said, yeah, it comes from Come Follow Me, because the references in Come Follow Me, people around the world are then pushing on the Saints pages that are on the See Also. And, that's just astronomical to think that there's this kind of interlocking directorate with Come Follow Me and Saints and these other publications. So we have, when Come Follow Me, the Doctrine and Covenants manual was being written, we had historians from our department. I was one of them, Matt Godfrey, Kate Holbrook. We reviewed every chapter of Come Follow Me. And so they benefited from historical expertise, and you can see it kind of working together.
Exciting. And that does, I think, relate to our next question, which is to some extent about the purpose of the book, right? And why the church is producing this in the first place. You raised earlier, Jed, this problem of difficulties in church history, of things that people have found troubling in church history. Could you talk to a certain extent about the ways in which Saints is grappling with that, and how you see what you're doing is maybe somewhat different from what earlier histories that church leaders have produced have done?
Right. Yeah, it's a great question. I mentioned earlier in my slides that, Saints was needed because of the demographic change, and that's absolutely true. You have to have stories that the current church recognizes as their own, like a Japanese story or an Argentinian story or whatever it is. And so we needed stories like that. But I think the other big sea change is that we now live in the age of digital content, not paper content, but digital content. And so what that has done is it's just thrown overboard just all of this stuff floating around in the internet about our past. And some of this is good, but a lot of it is just kind of half-baked, and some of it's flat out wrong. And that has created confusion, for better or worse. Of course, the founding narrative of our church is based on confusion, Joseph Smith's own. And so that can work to a beneficial result. But at the same time, we've seen a lot of devastation in families where people get confused over information consumption. And so clearly, what the church's history that is written, any attempt at a history in the digital age, it has to grapple with stories that are negative, stories that are troubling, that are difficult. So, for example, Seer Stones. Seer Stones have never been mentioned in an official history. The Urim and Thummim was mentioned. Joseph used that term as a shorthand for a seer stone, as near as we can tell. He used it interchangeably for the interpreters that went on breastplate and the spectacles, but also a seer stone that he found in the ground. But we haven't really come to grips with that history. Well, Saints does, just in a seamless way, weaves seer stone as well as the Urim and Thummim together. And so once young people, this is very important to me. Once young people who are reading Saints read the story written in this way with non-traditional elements that really have not been incorporated, then they can better assimilate what historians know, and so then when you learn a story when you're young, it's not as threatening as if you learned it one way when you're young, and then at age 30 or 40 or 50, someone says, oh, actually they had it wrong. This is what you should be believing. And so, on occasion, I get letters from seminary teachers who say, we read Saints in class and we love it. Well, there's no better letter for me than that letter from a seminary teacher, because it means that Saints and maybe the troubling elements of our past are being incorporated into the way young people think about the church. And they can then better grapple with those issues at a younger age than having to wait when they're older.
Well, there's a definitive history to be written about the history of Mormon history. And I really wish you would do it, Matt, because we need it. And, I mean, again, like, we don't have time to get into all the theory on this, but I think in the church, we're undergoing something of the same process that the United States has gone through in the last 50 or 60 years in grappling with our founding stories and our kind of mythologized or ritualized past, as it's been called, and finding that the story is a lot more complicated than what has been presented in the past. And there are good and understandable reasons for why history was written the way it was in the past. And there are good and understandable reasons for why that doesn't work for us anymore, and why we're asking different questions now. We have different sensibilities. In some cases, we have more information. The JSP project has turned up new material and has given us, new things to work with, new things to grapple with. So Saints is, implicated in that process, is part of that process of trying to come to terms with what our history is, how we want to tell that story, what the baseline of that narrative is. And it's done within, as Jed says, this context of the world that we live in now. I hope, it's not just a defensive project, and I hope that comes across. It's a constructive project. It's a project of affirming what the story is, what we believe, what the sacred parts of our history are. But as we work on it, we are very aware of where the sensitivities are and where the issues are. And one of the explicit purposes of the project is to make sure that those issues and questions and bits of information are incorporated and are grappled with.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I think what you both said is really important here. The question is not simply that there are simple narrative chunks that are difficult in the past. The question is the broad story that we've told and how we have or have not integrated those single troubling facts into a broader narrative. And I appreciate, or one of the efforts here is to tell a version that does integrate more of those things and deals with new problems and new issues that we are facing today.
So how did you go about deciding which of those perhaps more difficult or challenging stories were involved? And more generally, there's just so much to choose from, especially as you said, with more turning up all the time. What was the conversation around, or the criterion for deciding what stayed and what went?
Well, it's quite a process. Chad and I can testify to that. As he mentioned, there is nothing fictional in Saints. And one of the imperatives that we operate under is to tell the history through the experiences of people. And so that means we have to find characters whose experience can illustrate and speak to the larger historical narrative and issues that we're trying to address. And so that in and of itself makes it very complicated and difficult, because there's a million great stories out there. People have had all kinds of great experiences, and we'll go, and I know Jed's had this experience where you go do a fireside and someone says, well, what about my grandpa? And what about my great aunt? And my husband was the first missionary in such and such a place. And those stories are all really great, and we hope you tell them to your families. But we have to choose the stories based on this really constraining set of criteria about what the stories can do in a larger sense, as well as just being a really good story that we have adequate source material for our purposes. When it comes to, choosing which issues to address and so forth, I mean, this is why we have, volume editors and historians that are involved in the planning and the discussions about these volumes from early on. It's us, we consult with others who know the broad trajectory of the period that we're trying to cover. And so we're very aware of where the points of interest, the points of difficulty are. And that is baked into the process of planning the volumes from the beginning of, okay, which issues are we going to need to address here? How are we going to address them? What stories are going to help us address them? And then, and then there are painful decisions about what goes on the cutting room floor.
Yeah.
And we have so much good material we could publish, easily another volume for each volume that we have published.
Great answer from Lisa. I'll just add an example. In volume 3, we have 2 apostles who are dropped from the quorum as a result of their desire to continue performing post-manifesto plural marriages. And so this is Matthias Cowley and John W. Taylor. And at one time, I was quite taken with the fact that Matthias Cowley comes back to the church in 1936. Now, he never lost his membership. He was never actually, wasn't even, not only was he not excommunicated, he wasn't disfellowshipped. He was just told not to use his priesthood, which meant that he was not allowed to give blessings, or even he was not supposed to give talks in sacrament meeting. And so, but in 1936, there's a reconciliation where he really wants to go back to the temple. he wants to go on a mission. And so Heber J. Grant says, yeah, you can do that. You can do those things if you write a public confession. And so he works with David O. McKay to draft this confession, which is published in 1936, in April of 36. I was interested in this story as a story of reconciliation because I think we need more repentance stories. We need more I was healed stories. And but it turned out that it didn't work for our timing to have this story in 1936 for a lot of reasons. We're in the middle of a Great Depression. That's when the welfare plan is announced in April of 36. And so we couldn't fit it in. And it turned out that we drop the two apostles in 1911 and we don't return to Matthias Cowley. We just, we couldn't do it. And so this is an example of a character who has an interesting arc, but because of other constraints in the book, we weren't able to do it. And so, you know, I think we could go on about this, but we just have small outlining meetings where Lisa and I and Angela and Scott Hales, we just hash it out. Okay, what do we need to be doing here? And so it's like a brain trust that gets together and mostly makes decisions. And then once we draft based on these decisions that we make, and usually they're well received. You know, we've had great success going up the line. The edits are not drop this scene or drop this character. That's not the feedback we get. The feedback is on the level of the sentence or the word for the most part.
And I would just add that this is where our extensive review from outside readers and subject matter experts is also helpful, because if we have really missed something or if we haven't handled something well, they help us catch that.
Do you have a favorite, both of you, just briefly, a favorite lesser character that you excavated in the process or really fell in love with while doing this research?
Oh, well, Lisa doesn't like my long answers, so I'll try and be brief on this.
I love your long answers, Jed.
Yeah.
I just wish we had all night.
You know, just for the record, Lisa and I are good friends, so we have the greatest respect for each other. So I'm just kidding. I'll tell you, I get emotional when I talk about this character, Helga Meyer. So before I became managing editor of the project, or managing historian, I should say, I was the lead historian on V3, the volume we're working on right now. And the more I got into the archives to try and locate stories, because, you know, it was primarily my job to figure out, okay, who are the characters, what are the issues? And I didn't feel like we had the stories we needed. And I came to the conclusion that this was because a lot of these people that we needed, mainly Europeans, because, you know, we end the volume with the Swiss temple, they never came to the United States. And so as a consequence, their records, their life stories or journals, if they kept them, they never ended up in the archives. I think they're probably in private hands in Europe or maybe destroyed in the war. I think a lot of stuff got destroyed in the war. And so this was a big problem for me. And I started praying about what to do. And I felt like I needed to go to the Harold B. Lee Library at BYU on Saturday afternoons and just start reading the biography shelf. There's a huge shelf in the Mormon books section just on biography. And I got permission from my wife and I said, look, you mind if I go Saturday afternoons? And so I would pray as I went down that I would be led. And on this one particular day, I pulled a memoir off the shelf called Under a Leafless Tree, the story of a Mormon girl from East Prussia. And I read this memoir, and it was exactly what we needed. And it turned out that Helga, who wrote the memoir, she was the visiting teacher of a woman named Lark Galley. So Helga, the German woman, was the visiting teacher of Lark, and turned out that Helga, she was raised in Nazi Germany. She was a young woman in the church who was a beehive and chose the beehives over the BDM, which was Hitler Youth Group. And she was a missionary in World War II, and just a beautiful memoir of what it was like to live at that time in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. And, but she never would have written it down had Lark Galley, the woman whom with whom she interacted in the visiting teaching program, had Lark not said, look, you need to get your story down. You just talk to me and I'll record it and we'll get it down on paper. And Lark then published this as in a vanity press. Just, you know, she just felt like it needed to get out, and BYU happened to have a copy. I ended up knocking on Lark's door about a week later in Salt Lake, and I said, hey, this character is exactly what we need for Saints. I have questions for you. And she said, well, Helga is still alive. You can just ask your questions of her. Helga was 96. She was born in 1920. This was in 2016 when I met her, and she was still very much, you know, with it. And I ended up spending many hours with Helga. She passed away 2 years ago. And so this character that means so much to me was, she's in 10 scenes. She is our point of view for the end of World War II in Berlin. She is in Berlin at the time the Soviets overrun the city as a missionary. And I'm just very grateful that I was led to her, and that she's in this book. So, sorry.
Racist.
Yeah, I mean, I can't add a lot to that. Jed has had some amazing, and the team. I haven't been as involved in the frontline research like that, but I know there have been just some amazing, miraculous experiences in finding people and in finding sources. There's so many wonderful characters. Obviously, I'm going to say that I love Susie Young Gates. She's my girl, and I'm working on her biography, and I was so glad that we were able to work her in as a character. She's in volume 2 and volume 3. And I had an experience not too long ago with a really dear friend of mine who I hadn't talked to her for quite a while because, you know, COVID this year has disrupted a lot of relationships. And she very, very earnestly and tearfully told me how much the story of Sousa and her divorce had meant to her, because she, my friend, finds herself in the middle of a really painful and difficult divorce. And reading the story of this little young Susie Dunford at the time, and taking on this legal system all by herself, and losing everything in the way that she did. That story's in volume 2. And this friend of mine just felt that was such a powerful story and so helpful to her. And I think that there are many stories like that in Saints. And that is one of the things we've had an eye to as we choose characters and stories. It's not just the past, not just the historical narrative, but when do their experiences speak to questions and problems and experiences that we know our brothers and sisters in the church are having now, and can speak to the pain and the difficulties and the questions that people have now. And that's just one little example of an incident where I know that has worked out.
And that's really powerful, I think, both of you. So thanks for sharing those thoughts. I think we'll wrap up with one final question, and it's a rather broad one. I think what we've been talking about tonight is the ways in which history and doing history intersects with faith and belief. And there's a lot of simple narratives out there, right? That history must lead to faith or history must destroy faith. Sometimes I think many members of the church feel as though those are the only two options with which they are presented. And I wonder if the two of you might speak a little bit to how you've experienced, right, doing the research and writing these stories, and how that has changed or deepened or altered how you experience faith yourselves.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's one that I know frequently, and I'm sure Jed does too. History cannot prove anything. History cannot prove Joseph Smith saw or didn't see, or translated or didn't translate by whatever means. History is at best a reconstruction based on the sources that we have, and at best it's a very good reconstruction and done in good faith to try to understand the perspective and the experiences of the people who are involved. My testimony and my faith are in the gospel of Jesus Christ, and are in the power and the peace and the light and the knowledge that the gospel brings into my life. And so when I go into history and look at the experiences of people in the past, that's what I'm looking for, is how have they found and experienced that power, that peace, that knowledge for themselves? How, from the distance that we have to be able to reflect on people and their experiences, how do we see the Lord shaping and guiding and helping people to become more than they could be on their own, helping them to face the just fundamental human condition that we all experience in this life? To me, that's what is faith promoting in history. And it is admittedly a perspective that we bring to bear when we do history. But as I said in the beginning, when we look at people's experience in that way, it does bear witness. And and that to me is faith enhancing, more than trying to use history in a polemical way to prove or disprove or argue about this, that, or the other. We have to take a broader view, and also one that's really rooted in the human experience and in the fact that these are people and in their experiences. And that's where, for me, history and faith intersect.
I go back to the book of Abraham, where the conversation is that we will prove them herewith. We will create a world and we will prove them herewith. And I think when we come down to earth, someone who has a religious sensitivity, the evidence is never entirely overwhelming. So even the strongest believer, they have lots of evidence. They have amassed a faith that works from faith into knowledge, but you're not given everything that you wish you were given. I mean, for example, like a one-to-one kind of correspondence between me and the knowledge of Joseph Smith's vision, first vision, would be that I'm in the grove. But I'm not in the grove, and I was never invited into the grove or the woods. And so my understanding is going to be partial. And we just have to recognize that partial understanding is part of the human condition. And for a person of faith, for myself, I think that is intentional. I believe that if the Lord had given us overwhelming evidence in favor, that it would work to our detriment. We wouldn't be able to choose. I mean, if you have overwhelming evidence, what does that require of me? Very little. You know, it doesn't require any effort, any faith, any leap of faith on my part. And so the evidence is always going to be fragmented and it's going to be contradictory. We have to get used to that. I think both pro and con, often you see an attempt to stack the evidence so that no one has to think, no one has to choose. And to me, that doesn't resonate, because I think, I mean, look at the vagueness in the sources on Jesus Christ's life, right? I mean, we have one source, maybe two sources from the first century that even mention him. We are reliant on the gospel accounts and our faith. We have to take a step out to believe that the writers who write in depth in the Book of Mormon or in the Gospels in the New Testament, that they were telling the truth and that these were passed down to us in a truthful way. So I just, that would be one part of it, that we need faith and just come to grips with the fact that the past is going to be murky, and that's part of the plan for me. And I'd say the other part of it that I just end with is the Lord asks us to have charity, faith, hope, and charity, but above all, charity, right? And again, religious people, we try and be charitable in our relationships at home. We think primarily in terms of the present, but I believe that the Lord would have us be charitable towards past historical actors. I think they're doing the best they could. And when we veer away from charity to animosity, criticism, even venom, we're going the wrong direction. And so I think it doesn't mean that we can't critique what went on, or even say, look, this was wrong. We were wrong in this. I mentioned the Mountain Meadows Massacre. We were wrong. But it does mean that if you're going to talk about past historical actors, they're no longer there to answer. I mean, we believe that they're there in the spirit, right? But they can't answer your criticism. So if you're going to be a prosecuting attorney and not allow them to answer, I don't think that's very fair. And so I think we just need to be charitable, sympathetic to the degree we can, and recognize that past historical actors were doing the best they could under the circumstances. And that if we were in their shoes, we might have chosen the same way. I think if I had been a militiaman in Cedar City in 1857, how would I have gone? We'd like to think that we would have been above the fray, but I think it's probably unrealistic to think that way. So I'll leave it at that. I appreciate the chance to talk with you. I hope that this has been affirming and interesting on some level, and we'd be happy to do it again after the next volume comes out.
Awesome, thank you so much. And I know the time zones, it's a little bit later, so we'll go ahead and wrap up. So our benediction tonight will be given by Lynn Forrester, a longtime member of the Mormon Studies Council, who is a native here of Claremont, where we're based. She has 4 children and has spent the past 2 decades working with students at Claremont High School, and in 2014 was awarded Employee of the Year, which is not surprising to anyone who knows her. She's also my Relief Society president, and a very good one at that. So Lynn, if you want to go ahead, we just made you a panelist.
Father in heaven, we're grateful this evening that we could gather together and listen to these 2 presenters share the process and the stories of the saints. We are grateful for their efforts and for their testimonies they've shared with us and the spirit that we felt. We're grateful for these volumes of history and for the things that they will help us to learn and to understand, and indeed to help us find charity for those who we don't have a full understanding of. Bless us in our own efforts to share our own histories and to strengthen those around us with our testimonies of the things that we've learned through one another. Again, we thank thee for our participation here tonight and ask thee that thou might be with us all. And these things we pray for in the name of thy Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Please join us next month in March. On March 14th, Melissa Inoue will join us. She is a historian. She's an author of a recent book, Crossings, a bald Asian American Latter-day Saint woman scholar's adventures through life, death, cancer, and motherhood, not necessarily in that order. She will be wonderful, I'm sure. And we remind you one last time, if you enjoyed this fireside, please sign up on our email list and please donate. You can find the link in your chat box or at mormonstudies.cgu.edu. Thank you and have a good night.